Future historians may well look upon June 2nd, 2015 as one of the most transformational days in Canada's history. Whether or not they view it in that regard depends on our generation and the work we do in our future careers. For most of Canada's history, from the moment of European contact with Indigenous peoples through to Confederation, European settlers enjoyed a prosperous relationship with Indigenous peoples. Military alliances between these two groups allowed Britain to fight off American invasion attempts in the War of 1812, paving the way for Canada to become a nation. However, leading up to Canada's Confederation, that relationship began to change. After Confederation in 1867, our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, endorsed and expanded an existing residential school system that had been started by a small number of churches. This system took Indigenous children away from their family units, often hundreds of kilometers from their home communities. For over a century, approximately 150,000 Indigenous children passed through the residential school system, with the last one closing in 1996.
People in our community couldn't even talk about it. The word residential school would silence a room or a whole room full of people because it was just so traumatic to ourselves.
Canada's collective silence was broken in the 1990s when residential school survivors banded together to demand an inquiry into the residential school system. Their collective action resulted in the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the federal government and churches were responsible. Part of the settlement agreement included the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. From 2008 to 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard witness from thousands of residential school survivors across Canada, culminating in their closing ceremony on June 2nd, 2015. At the closing ceremony, the commissioners released a set of 94 recommendations to promote reconciliation across all sectors of Canadian society, including health, education, justice, and business. The 92nd call to action calls upon Canada's corporate sector to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. This includes meaningful consultation with Indigenous communities to obtain free, prior, and informed consent on development projects. Also, to ensure Indigenous people have equitable access to jobs, education, and training in the corporate sector, and that Indigenous communities realize long-term benefits from development projects. Lastly, to provide education to both staff and management about residential schools, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and other topics including Indigenous-Crown relations, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism training. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP, is an important international human rights instrument and was passed by the General Assembly on September 13, 2007. The Declaration does not confer upon Indigenous peoples special rights. Rather, it seeks to remedy the fact that Indigenous peoples have traditionally and historically been excluded from full participation in their respective countries. Canada has a constitutional responsibility to consult with Indigenous communities as resource development projects are pursued on or near their traditional land base. This has not always been the case, and their rights to land, food, and economic participation have been impacted. A quick Google search using Duty to Consult and First Nations will provide examples of this complex issue. First Nation students receive 30% less education funding than non-Indigenous students, leading to lower educational outcomes and labor market participation. Communities that do benefit from resource development projects typically enjoy short-term employment benefits during the construction phase with no long-term sustainable economic benefits. Combined together, Indigenous communities are overwhelmed by high rates of poverty and despair. Finally, the commissioners noted that generations of Canadians have grown up not knowing about residential schools, while at the same time believing the mythology that Indigenous culture is inferior to Western culture. By taking these actions listed under CTA 92, Canada's corporate sector can advance reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So, how did the business community respond? Well, they were silent, presumably waiting to follow the lead of the Conservative government that reserved comment until the release of the final report in December later that year. However, a fall federal election preempted their opportunity to respond to the final report. The Liberal Party, who campaigned on the promise to fully implement the TRC's calls to action, had won a sizable majority government, prompting the business community to take notice. In their 2017 report, Coming Together Making Progress, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce reported that they began to look at businesses' role in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples after the 2015 federal election. Locally, the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce partnered with the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council in 2016 to form an employer consortium to actively respond to the CTA 92. Membership includes the Business Council of Manitoba, Assiniboine Credit Union, and Johnston Group.
Our CEO, Kevin Sitka, is very much involved in Truth and Reconciliation, as well as our entire executive team.
Well, I think Johnston Group is like most Winnipeg and Manitoba companies. We're really, in the context of journey, we're really at the beginning of the journey. I think we're past the point where we're wondering whether this should be a priority. We know it should be.
Assiniboine Credit Union publicly committed to Truth and Reconciliation along with two other credit unions across Canada. That was a couple of years ago. And since then, this past year, Assiniboine Credit Union participated in signing the Winnipeg Indigenous Accord. So that was one of our initiatives that we've done.
Yeah, the company's not going to be engaged to the level they need to be, which means investment, which means mobilizing staff if the executive suite isn't on side. So that started with David Johnson, but certainly our senior management team, which makes up 10 people, are absolutely on side with this. But we also know that unless we integrate it throughout the organization, that we're not going to achieve the success that we can. So I think it starts with the leadership team, but there needs to be a strategy in terms of how it feathers through the organization.
Let's examine these perspectives from the lens of organizational theory. Assiniboine Credit Union and Johnston Group both have CEOs who have set reconciliation as a strategic priority for their organizations. Additionally, both companies have a strong management team that supports this vision. As more businesses move towards building reconciliation within their organizations, this has practical implications for your future careers.
I think there's two responsibilities. One is before you get into the workplace, and one is after you get into the workplace. I think before you get into the workplace, individuals by themselves should get involved in any kind of orientation around the Indigenous community. Going through some of the history, going through some of the culture, learning about the impact of residential schools, trying to get an understanding of what some of the issues are and the reasons for them before you get to the workplace, because then you bring that with you into the workplace. And once you are hired and find your first position, I would like to see the next generation of employees be real strong advocates for the importance of this. I think all of us should right now have an appetite, and a very strong appetite for knowledge, because that's really what's going to create the kind of understanding that will change the nature of workplaces and how we embrace Indigenous employees.
While the business community anticipates your contributions towards building a Reconcile Canada, both of these organizations have experienced some minor successes in this early part of their journey towards reconciliation.
And one of the successes we've seen as an organization is the development of an Indigenous leadership circle. That for us was important, but it's really interesting because it was employee driven. It's an employee driven Indigenous leadership circle that wants to provide experiences and education to ACU employees. And we're finding that that's really empowering for employees.
At a 2017 gathering of the Indigenous Leadership Circle, Assiniboine Credit Union employees were excited to learn about the 7 sacred teachings prevalent in Indigenous culture. The teachings around truth, humility, wisdom, honesty, courage, love, and respect aligned well with Assiniboine Credit Union's corporate values. Assiniboine Credit Union's experience correlating the 7 sacred teachings with their own corporate values is quite similar in scope to an exercise undertaken by Johnston Group, as Dave Angus explains.
We did a big values discussion. We mobilized all staff, including those that look after our Indigenous product, talking about what does Johnston Group stand for, what is our culture, how do we make decisions, and we now are looking at how do we incorporate the 7 teachings from the Indigenous view into our values. And so we're just at that step right now and taking a look at how we can take the values that we heard from our staff, but also incorporate that Indigenous lens, which will be so important in our ability to be able to attract and retain Indigenous employees. So again, we're at early stages, but everything starts with education, understanding, and relationship building.
These learning opportunities and integration of Indigenous values within their organization will serve to not only strengthen their ability to engage with the Indigenous community, but also to promote mutual respect with Indigenous and non-Indigenous employees. A final consideration with respect to business's role in promoting reconciliation is that there are 2 sides to it. The first is executive responsibility, and the second is economic opportunity. Let's explore those issues.
Reconciliation is an opportunity. We've got the fastest growing population in Canada. So if you're running any kind of organization and you're not including engagement with the fastest growing population in the country in your strategic planning, then you'll become irrelevant.
So if companies are just focused on doing the right thing, I think that's great. But what's going to make it sustainable is a real understanding of the business case for this. The Indigenous community is the fastest growing segment of our population. The number one issue for business is the attraction and retention of skills in order to facilitate their growth. If they do not have an Indigenous employment strategy, they're actually putting their company at risk.
If we want to reach our potential as a province, we have to fully engage with the Indigenous community, with the future workforce, with the Indigenous students. So Business Council Manitoba, as an example, identified that as their key priority in their 5-year strategic plan.
While it is difficult to unpack centuries of trauma and to adequately describe the dysfunctional relationship that has existed between Canada's Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, I hope you feel inspired to become the leader that promotes reconciliation required by the business community to create a better and more prosperous future for all Canadians.
If there's any province across this country that should be leading in this, it's Manitoba. Because of the importance of it to all of us. And so let's lead. And it's going to take us working together to do that. But let's make sure this is a rallying cry for all partners to come together. We can be the best at this. So let's first decide to be, and let's do the work necessary. And it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take investment. But let's do it, because at the end of the day, it's not only what the right thing is to do, it's in our best interests collectively as Manitobans.